The sea chose its moment carefully. It waited until night, until the ship was far from any shore, until the wind rose without warning, and the waves grew tall and cruel. When the first great crash of water struck the vessel, Rosalind knew, deep in her bones, that something terrible had begun. As the ship lurched and the world tipped sideways, one thought passed through her mind with strange calm. If this is how I die, at least I will be free of him. Rosalind had served in the house of Duke Adrian Ashworth for 7 years. 7 long years of silence and obedience. She had scrubbed his floors, carried his trays, polished the silver he never noticed. To the Duke, she was not a person. She was part of the furniture. He never spoke her name. He never looked at her twice. He was known as a cold man, sharp and distant, feared by servants and respected by society. People whispered about his past, about the young wife he lost and the child who died with her, and how grief had turned him into stone. Rosalind did not think of him as tragic. She thought of him as unfeeling. The voyage south had been his decision. Business in the southern colonies, the housekeeper said. Rosalind had been ordered to go with the household staff. She packed her small trunk with 2 uniforms and her mother's rosary, the only thing of value she owned. She boarded the ship without hope and without complaint. That was how her life had always been. The ship, the Arabella, carried the Duke in comfort above deck while the servants slept below in narrow bunks. The air was thick with salt and sweat. Rosalind kept her head down. When she saw the Duke in passing, he moved through the corridors like a stranger made of marble. Handsome, yes, but empty. She felt nothing toward him but weariness. Then the storm came. The ship screamed as wood split and ropes snapped. People cried out in terror. Rosalind was thrown from her bunk and struck the floor hard. She fought her way up through darkness and chaos, gripping walls as the ship tilted like a dying animal. On deck, the sky was black and torn by lightning. Waves rose like walls around them. The mast had cracked. Water poured in faster than the crew could fight it. Someone pushed past her. Someone screamed her name, or perhaps screamed nothing at all. Then a wave smashed over the rail and dragged her into the sea. The cold stole her breath. Black water filled her mouth and nose. She sank, spinning, her body heavy and useless. In that moment, she stopped struggling. She thought of her mother. She thought of the years she had spent unseen. And then everything went dark. She woke to pain and heat. Sand pressed into her cheek. The sun burned overhead. For a long time, she could not move. When she finally lifted her head, she coughed up salt water and blinked against the light. She was alive. The beach curved around her. Pale sand and scattered wreckage. Broken wood. Torn cloth. Pieces of a life that no longer existed. And then she saw him. A man lay farther down the shore, stretched out and still. Even before she reached him, she knew who it was. The tall frame, the dark hair. The Duke of Ashworth lay face down in the sand. Her heart hammered as she knelt beside him. She hesitated, unsure if she was allowed to touch him even now. Then he gasped and rolled onto his back, drawing in air like a man pulled from the grave. His eyes flew open and locked on hers. For the first time, she saw fear in them. "You," he said hoarsely. "The maid."
"Yes, sir," Rosalind replied out of habit.
"Are you hurt?" He ignored the question and sat up, staring around in disbelief. The empty beach, the silent sea. No ship, no crew, nothing. He stood and called out names. Officers, servants. No one answered. The truth settled in slowly and cruelly. They were alone. The first day passed in shock. They gathered what they could from the wreckage: crates, rope, a torn sail. The Duke gave orders as if they were still aboard ship. Rosalind obeyed without speaking. Her body ached. Her mind felt hollow. This was familiar, he commanded. She worked. On the second day, hunger clawed at them both. The last biscuits were gone. The Duke spent hours at the shore fashioning a crude line. When he finally caught a fish, he held it up with grim pride. "Cook this," he said, tossing it toward her. "I'm starving." Rosalind stared at the fish. Her hands shook. She was dizzy with hunger. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same expectation she had known all her life, that she would obey, that she would shrink. "Did you hear me?" he snapped. "Cook it." Something inside her broke open. Without speaking, Rosalind raised the fish and bit into it. The flesh was cold and raw. She chewed and swallowed, ignoring the burn in her throat. She ate every last piece. The Duke stared at her in disbelief. "That was my fish," he said. "I caught it." She wiped her mouth and met his eyes. For the first time in 7 years, she did not lower her gaze. "No," she said. The word hung between them, heavy and dangerous. "No," he repeated. "You dare say no to me?" "Yes," she said. "I dare." His face flushed with rage. He threatened her with dismissal, with ruin, with a future where she would never work again. In another place and another time she would have been terrified. But here, on this empty shore, his title meant nothing. "If we are rescued," she said quietly, "until then you can cook your own meals. I am no longer your servant." She turned and walked away, her heart pounding. She expected him to follow, to shout, to strike her. He did nothing. That night, as she lay beneath the sail they had raised for shelter, Rosalind dreamed of her mother, of all the women who had said yes because they believed they had no choice, and for the first time she wondered if they had been wrong. The days that followed were tense. The Duke struggled with survival. Rosalind did not. She knew how to build fires, how to find water, how to make tools from nothing. At first, he barked orders. She ignored them. She worked beside him, not beneath him. Slowly, unwillingly, he began to learn. He learned to fish, to gather wood, to listen. One evening, sitting across the fire, he said, "This is absurd. You are a servant. I am a duke." "The strong survive," Rosalind replied. "Titles do not keep you alive here." He stared into the flames, and for the first time, something in him shifted. Weeks passed. The island changed them both. The Duke's anger softened. He learned to laugh, awkwardly at first. Rosalind saw glimpses of the man beneath the cold shell, a man shaped by loss, by duty, by loneliness. One night as the sun sank red into the sea, he spoke of his wife, of holding his child and watching life leave him. Rosalind listened without judgment. She offered no empty comfort, only truth. "I am sorry," she said. He looked at her as if no one had ever spoken to him that way before. After that, the space between them grew smaller. One evening, sitting beneath the stars, he spoke her name, Rosalind. Her breath caught. In that moment, the island felt very small, and the world they had left behind felt very far away. She did not yet know what this change would cost them, only that something had begun the day she ate the fish and said no, and nothing would ever be the same again. After the night he spoke her name, nothing returned to what it had been before. Rosalind felt it in the air between them, in the way his eyes lingered now, no longer passing through her as if she were invisible. He still kept his distance, still guarded himself with sharp words at times, but something had cracked. The Duke of Ashworth was learning how to be a man without walls. Life on the island settled into a rhythm. They rose with the sun and worked side by side. Rosalind showed him how to trap crabs among the rocks and how to dry fish in the sun so it would last longer. He listened, truly listened, and followed her instructions without complaint. At first, this obedience felt strange to both of them. Then, it felt natural. One afternoon, while weaving palm leaves into a roof, he grew frustrated. The leaves slipped through his fingers and collapsed again and again. "This is impossible," he muttered. Rosalind laughed before she could stop herself. He looked up sharply. "What is funny?" "You're weaving," she said. "My grandmother could do better, and she was blind in one eye." She expected anger. Instead, after a long moment, his mouth twitched. Then he laughed. The sound startled them both. It was rough and unused, like a door opening after years of being shut. That was the first time Rosalind realized how lonely he had been. As the weeks passed, they spoke more in the evenings. The fire became a place of stories. He told her of his childhood, of a father who demanded perfection and affection only through discipline, of a mother who loved him but never knew how to show it. Rosalind spoke of her village, of her mother's worn hands and her quiet warnings about hope. "You deserved more," he said once, simply. No one had ever said that to her before. The closeness crept in slowly. A shared glance, a brush of hands while passing tools, a moment of silence that felt full instead of empty. Rosalind fought against it at first. She reminded herself of the truth. He was a duke. She was a servant. The island was not the world. This could not last. But the island did not care for rules. The rain came one evening, sudden and heavy. They ran for shelter, soaked through, laughing without meaning to. The fire had gone out. The night was cold. Without thinking, Rosalind moved closer to him for warmth. He stilled. She felt his breath hitch. Her heart thundered. She should have moved away. She knew that. Instead, she stayed. "Rosalind," he said quietly. "Yes, I have tried not to feel this." She swallowed. "So have I." He lifted his hand, slow and uncertain, and touched her cheek. His fingers were rough from work, warm and careful. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, as if asking permission. When she answered, the kiss deepened, full of hunger and wonder and disbelief. For Rosalind, it felt like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime of shadow. They did not speak of love that night. They did not need to. They were together, and that was enough. Afterward, lying beside each other beneath the shelter, Rosalind stared at the dark ceiling and felt fear creep in beside the joy. This island was a dream. Dreams ended, but for now, she chose to stay inside it. They became inseparable, partners in survival, companions in everything.
End of section 2.
The Duke learned how to live without command. Rosalind learned how it felt to be chosen. One evening, as they watched the stars, she told him of her old dream. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, "before life decided otherwise." "Why is that no longer possible?" he asked. She laughed softly. "Because I was born wrong." He turned to her, serious. "You were born capable." The words stayed with her. Months passed. The island felt like home. They explored its hidden places together. A quiet cove, a waterfall that spilled into clear water. In that place, free from eyes and judgment, Rosalind laughed like she had as a child. The Duke held her as if she were precious, not something borrowed. Then one morning, everything changed. He saw it first, a dark shape on the horizon, a ship. Rosalind felt the ground fall away beneath her. This was rescue. This was the end. They stood in silence as the ship drew closer. Hope and dread twisted together in her chest. "What happens now?" she asked. "We face the world, together." When the ship reached them, the sailors stared as if seeing ghosts. They had been presumed dead. The Duke identified himself, and disbelief turned to awe. Rosalind stood beside him, suddenly aware of her torn clothes, her bare feet, the way the world would see her again. On board, everything felt wrong. Too many people, too many eyes, too many rules returning all at once. The Duke made his choice immediately. He ordered that Rosalind be treated as a lady, placed near his own cabin. The captain hesitated only once before obeying. During the long voyage back, they spoke of the future in careful terms. He spoke of scandal, of anger, of loss. "I will not ask you to be hidden," he said, "and I will not ask you to be my shame." Her heart ached with love and fear. "We will see," she said. "Let us return first." England rose from the sea like a memory she was not sure she belonged to anymore. The cold air, the gray sky, the heavy weight of expectation. In London, the whispers began immediately. The Duke was celebrated. The Maid was questioned. His mother moved first. The Dowager Duchess was furious. She demanded Rosalind be sent away. She threatened ruin. She called Rosalind a schemer and a disgrace. Rosalind offered to leave. The Duke refused. "You are my choice," he said. "I will not unmake you to satisfy her." The battle that followed was quiet but cruel. Doors closed. Invitations vanished. Newspapers hinted and accused. Rosalind learned what it meant to be visible and unwelcome at the same time. Then help came from an unexpected place, Lady Sophia Blackwood. She came without judgment and spoke with kindness. She believed Rosalind. She offered friendship when Rosalind had none. Through her, Rosalind learned how to stand in this new world, not as a servant, not as a duchess, but as herself. Months passed. The Duke endured his mother's anger and society's coldness. He stood firm. When he asked Rosalind to marry him, she did not answer at once. "Let time pass," she said. "If you still wish this, knowing the cost, then I will believe it." Time passed. He did not waver. And when he asked again, she said yes. But the world was not finished with them yet. The wedding would not be simple. His mother would not come. Some would never forgive. Some would never forget. Rosalind stood at the edge of everything she had never been meant to have and felt fear twist inside her. Yet she remembered the island, the fish, the word no. And she knew she would not step back now. The story that began with a storm was not over yet. It was only entering its final test. The wedding morning arrived quiet and gray, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Rosalind stood in a small chamber at Ashworth Hall, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The room smelled of roses and rain. The gown laid out beside her was simple ivory silk. Nothing grand, nothing meant to impress. She had asked for that. She did not want to pretend to be someone else. She wanted to stand before Adrian as who she truly was. A maid entered to help her dress, young and nervous, eyes wide with curiosity. Rosalind smiled gently at her. Once she had been that girl, invisible, careful, afraid to speak. When she was ready, Lady Sophia took her hands. "You are steady," Lady Sophia said softly.
"I am terrified,"
Rosalind replied.
"Yes," Lady Sophia said with a smile.
That is usually how courage feels. The chapel bells rang. As Rosalind walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of the past pressing against her back. All the women before her, her mother, her grandmother, women who had bent and endured and never asked for more. She carried them with her, step by step. Adrian waited at the altar, his eyes fixed on her as if the rest of the world had faded away. When she reached him, his hand trembled slightly as he took hers. The vicar spoke the words. The vicar spoke the words. The vows were simple, honest. When Adrian said her name, when he promised his life to hers, Rosalind felt something settle inside her at last. When they were pronounced husband and wife, he kissed her without hesitation. The sound of applause was scattered but real. It was enough. His mother did not come. Rosalind felt the absence like a shadow, but it did not break her. Some wounds belonged to others. Life after the wedding was not a fairy tale. There were cold glances. There were whispers behind fans. There were rooms where conversation stopped when she entered. Rosalind learned to lift her chin and keep walking. At Ashworth Hall, she took her role seriously. She knew the servants' lives because she had lived them. She changed small things first. Better food, fair wages, rest days, respect. Some resisted. Some doubted her. But slowly, trust grew. Mrs. Granger, the housekeeper, came to her one evening with stiff posture and careful words. "I was wrong about you," she said, "and I am sorry." Rosalind accepted the apology without pride. Allies were built from honesty, not power. Adrian stood beside her always, in public, in private. When criticism came, he answered it calmly. When anger rose, he met it without fear. "You changed me," he told her one night. "You reminded me how to live." "And you gave me room to grow," she replied. They built a life together, not perfect, but real. Rosalind opened a small school on the estate. At first, only a handful of children came, servants' children, tenant children. She taught them to read and write the way she had taught herself long ago. People talked. A duchess did not teach. Rosalind continued anyway. The school grew. Years passed. The world shifted, slowly, quietly. Rosalind became a mother. 2 daughters born on a stormy night that reminded her of the sea. She held them close and promised herself they would never be taught to shrink. Adrian adored them. He laughed more, smiled more, loved without restraint. His mother never came to see them. That loss stayed, but it did not poison their joy. Time took its toll, as it always does. Adrian grew weaker with age. His breath shortened. Rosalind learned to treasure each ordinary moment, a shared meal, a quiet walk, his hand in hers. When he died, peacefully with her beside him, grief nearly broke her. But she endured. She had learned how. Years later, as an old woman, Rosalind sat by the window of Ashworth Hall and watched the sun set over the land she had helped shape. Her granddaughters sat at her feet, asking for stories. She told them this one, about a storm, about a shipwreck, about a duke who ordered a maid to cook, about a woman who ate the fish and said no, and how that one word changed everything. When she finished, the girls were quiet. Was it scary? One asked. Yes, Rosalind said. But it was worth it. As the light faded, Rosalind closed her eyes with a soft smile. She had not been born powerful, but she had learned to choose, and that had been enough.